You've probably scrambled a Rubik's Cube before. It's not too difficult. Turn the layers randomly, and well, you're basically there. On the other hand, solving a Rubik's Cube is a different story, requiring a precise sequence of layer turns guided by intuition and memorizing complex algorithms. But what if I told you that in the world of speed cubing, competing to see who can get the fastest time in solving a Rubik's Cube, scrambling a Rubik's Cube is actually the most complex part of the process, by a long shot. Consisting of strict regulations to ensure every single scramble is fair and identical, scrambling in competitions requires computers running complex algorithms navigating quintillions of Rubik's Cube states in search for a perfect scramble. But why exactly is scrambling so complicated? To understand how it all works, we first have to figure out how a human scrambles a Rubik's Cube. While you may not notice it, there are a huge array of things that your brain is subconsciously doing. For example, when you turn the right layer like this, your next move is obviously not going to be turning it back. Not only that, if you go and turn, say, the left layer after you've turned the right layer, you still can't go back to a right layer and turn it back again. That doesn't make any sense. As a human, your brain already knows about all of this, and you don't really pay any attention to your process. But let's think about what it means if we translate it over to a computer. The computer, of course, doesn't instinctively know the things that us humans do. So instead, we'll keep it simple by just doing random moves all over the cube, keeping track of the rules that we have stated before. Don't undo moves you've already done. By doing this, we've made what is known as a random move scrambler, because we are simply picking random moves to do on the cube. But this approach, while it seems good on the surface, has another limitation. Remember that scrambles that the computer spits out has to be executed by a real-life human. Thus, it can't be too long or it would not be feasible to scramble the cube at the competition. But the problem here is that if we limit the number of moves to a reasonable number, say 20, there's a high chance that the cube still isn't scrambled enough. Some sequences of moves will naturally cancel others out, making a cube much less scrambled than it should be. And in order to prevent this from happening, you would need to either hard-code an unreasonable amount of patterns to avoid, or implement numerous advanced algorithms to detect these cycles, involving a lot of manual work. In fact, for the 43 quintillion different combinations on a cube and a much larger number accounting for the possible number of sequences of moves, this might actually in fact be impossible. So how instead does the computer calculate the optimal scramble? The idea is that if we can somehow pick a single possible Rubik's Cube state out of all of the 43 quintillion with equal probability, checking to ensure that it is at least a certain amount of moves from solved, we'd have a sufficiently scrambled cube. Let's break this down. Imagine we have a giant list, assigning each possible state of the cube it can be in to one number on that list. Then we generate a random number to pick one element in that list with equal probability of getting each one. That's what the algorithm starts by doing. Of course, with some clever mathematics, there's no need to actually list out every single scramble, but the output that we get either way is quite similar. Then, after the random outcome is chosen, we then use a computerized solving algorithm to solve the Rubik's Cube state with an optimal number of moves. This algorithm in of itself is extremely complicated, but in essence, the computer tries hundreds if not thousands of possible moves in an attempt to solve part of the cube, and then repeats that various times to solve it completely. Then, the scrambling process checks the resulting solve sequence against the World Cube Association guidelines, the rulebook for all official Rubik's Cube competitions. In the guidelines, it is stated by default, all types of Rubik's Cubes require at least 2 moves to solve. Of course, there are numerous exceptions. For example, the 2x2 requires at least 4 moves, the Pure Minx requires 6 moves, and so on. Let's focus on the 3x3, which requires 2 moves. The scrambler checks if the current result that it has took 2 moves to solve. If not, it goes back to pick another possible scramble, solve it with the computerized algorithm, and checks it again. If it's good, then it moves on to the final stage of the scramble generation process. Now, you might be wondering, if the minimum move count was so low, how come we haven't seen such a simple solve yet, say in 3 or 4 moves? Now, the simple explanation is that the probability of such a solve is so small that it is nearly impossible. And that's actually also why that for small cubes like the 2x2, where there are way less combinations, and such a simple solve is way more likely, the minimum move count is set higher. Now, the algorithm that we've got so far tells us how to go from our verified scrambled state into a solved state, which is actually not what we want. Instead, we need to go from the solved state into the scrambled state. And much like you can reverse the directions to get from A to B on a map to go back from B to A, we fix our scramble by what is known as inverting the algorithm. We start by flipping each step of the algorithm from left to right. Then for each move that we do clockwise, we do counterclockwise, and vice versa. And there we have it, an algorithm that takes us from a solved state to a perfectly scrambled Rubik's Cube, according to the WCA at least. This entire process is known as random state scrambling, and as you may see, is definitely more complicated in a certain sense than actually solving the Rubik's Cube. But the story doesn't just end there. Remember that the 3x3 has 43 quintillion possible states. Random state scrambling requires first picking a state with equal probability within all of the possible states, as well as solving that state with an efficient but undeniably slow algorithm. On a 4x4 with magnitudes larger amounts of states, this process is already extremely slow. In fact, on the actual scrambling software, it's gotten so bad that there's a disclaimer telling people to be patient with 4x4 scrambling, as it runs slow on even the most powerful computers. So what happens to 5x5, 6x6, and even 7x7? Well, the simple answer is you don't scramble them. Well, at least not with random state. Think back to random move scrambling. We said that it couldn't work because there's a chance we'll end up with too simple of a scramble with a reasonable number of moves. Well, it turns out that on much larger cubes with both a naturally higher move count scramble and more moves that you can scramble with as there are more layers, random move actually works much better than it does on a normal 3x3. Thus, to compromise for speed of the scrambling, all cubes above and including 5x5 are scrambled with random move. They still require at least 2 moves to solve, but let's be honest, the chances of that happening after a long scramble is slim. In actual WCA competitions, all of this complex processing is done with an app known as T-Noodle, which the scramblers run behind the scene in their little hideout. So if you're interested in finding out more about how scrambling works and know a little bit of Java programming, it's definitely interesting to check out T-Noodle. So the next time you go scramble a cube, maybe think a little bit more about everything that's involved in doing so. Because the truth is, sometimes scrambling the cube is harder than solving it. I'll see you guys later. Peace.